Hey, this is Pastor Alex from Living Faith Bible Church, and for our first official Sermon Huddle video. As we begin 2022, we're going to be having sermon huddles after church each and every Sunday, as schedule permits, where for about 10 to 15 minutes or so, after we have a chance to get some refreshment and coffee, if it's being served that day, we huddle around for a discussion on Sunday morning after the sermon, where we talk a little bit about what the sermon meant for us, what points we resonated with, maybe some questions we had, and any areas where God's calling us to a greater commitment, and pray for one another. And I want to lead our church in that discussion on a regular basis on Sunday mornings so that we can really grasp and put into practice the sermons that we're studying each week. But I also want to release kind of a video during the week, call it Sermon Huddle video, where I review with you the sermon a little bit, think a little bit about it, encourage you to use this as for devotional material during the week, to work through the sermon, to think about implications and applications for your life. And so this is the first video I'm releasing in the new year. For our new sermon series this year that we're doing as we start out the new year on the book of Ecclesiastes, called Life in Focus. And this past Sunday, we started with chapters 1 and 2 of Ecclesiastes, and we're working our way through in 4 or 5 messages to work through the book of Ecclesiastes. This past Sunday, we looked at chapters 1 and 2, and we asked the question, am I living my life under the sun, S-U-N, or in the sun, S-O-N? And the big idea that I was hoping to communicate to you was only when we face life as it is, under the sun, can we grasp the full promise of life in the sun, S-O-N. Ecclesiastes is a tough book, isn't it? Because it asks very difficult questions. But one of the things that I'm learning is that you have to learn to ask difficult questions if you want answers. I shared with you a quote from Albert Einstein, the great genius, who said, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would use the first 55 minutes determining the proper questions to ask. And in many ways, Ecclesiastes is that book that allows us to ask a lot of questions, and in formulating the questions, the answers come. Solomon wrote this book, the king of Israel, who lived in Jerusalem, the son of David, who lived at the ultimate peak of Israel's history. He built the temple, and so much good happened during his reign, but so much bad happened in his life because he drifted away from God and the wisdom that he knew, and he was drawn away by the foreign wives that he married in the harem, and all of that that's described for us in 1 Kings, the first 10 or so, 11, 12 chapters of 1 Kings. You can follow that and see how his life trajectory headed downward, unfortunately. But yet he writes this book out of his observations about what was happening in his life. And in asking a lot of questions, we discover a lot of things about our lives as well. And so I want to encourage you during the course of this sermon series to be asking the questions that Solomon is asking, to try and get the answers we're looking for our life for this coming year. I want to share with you a section from the sermon where Solomon describes life in very difficult terms, asking a lot of big questions about life. And I want to think with you and reflect with you on how we can use these questions to help us as well. So I'm going to share with you now this little section here. Listen with me as we kind of wrestle through this a little bit.
And one of the things that Solomon asserts and then goes to prove through his own life is that life is empty. I know some of you are saying, that's not what I came to hear. Stick with me. We're going to get to the good part, but you got to work your way through the stuff first. Solomon, in reflecting on his life, says life is empty. Look at what he says in verse 2, chapter 1, verse 2. Meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Wow. That's really encouraging. It says in verse 3, what do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? It's a shocking statement. It's shocking for two reasons. One, it's written by a man who was one of the richest and wisest in all the world, and it's also in the Bible. It's like, why is this in the Bible? What am I supposed to learn from this? But we have to understand some of the terms that he uses here to help us understand this. First of all, he uses the phrase under the sun. Do you see that there? He says, what does a person gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun, S-U-N? And what he is doing is Solomon is restricting his field of view to only what he can see. It's like he's a scientist saying, it's only what I can touch, what I can taste, what I can feel. I'm going to restrict my observations to everything underneath the sun, in the plane of horizons. I'm not going to think about what lies beyond. And when he does that, he finds himself struggling with trying to find meaning with life under the sun. He's living his life completely horizontal, no vertical. No recognition of God. He's just living his life on the vertical. You might say, well, why could that be helpful for us in our day to think that way? Because so many people do live that way. So many people live their life with no reference to anything above the horizon. Sometimes we need to see what the implications of that is, and Solomon shows us that. He uses the word meaning.
You think that? You think a lot of your family and friends who don't know Christ, maybe even some that do, are sort of living their life just simply under the sun, S-U-N, and that this book could actually be very relevant for us to rethink what life is all about. Maybe these questions that Solomon is asking are very relevant for us to jar us to our senses.
Meaningless, and actually it's a word which means vapor-like. It's actually a Hebrew word, hevel, and it can mean futile, transitory. It could mean wind. It could be absurd. It could be stupid. It could be senseless, vain, pointless, disappointing, fleeting, fragile, flimsy, or meaningless. It's all those words. It kind of captures. It's this sense of like a vapor-like quality. Like when you grab vapor, it can't hold on to it. And that's how he's describing life, again, under the sun. He also says, if that wasn't enough, he says life is monotonous.
Well, I'm going to stop there with my sermon from this section of last Sunday's sermon, just simply to say that having this perspective of Solomon could potentially be very, very devastating, very, very discouraging. And maybe that's why some people stay away from the book of Ecclesiastes. But I think this perspective, though, could be helpful for us to think through our life and whether or not we are focused on the wrong things. If our life is focused on only what is under the sun, S-U-N, then our lives eventually will be vapor-like, will be meaningless, because all these things eventually will go away. And if we're trying to find our meaning in 2022 from only what is under the sun, S-U-N, we will not find the meaningful life that God has for us. But rather, we should be seeing our lives as the promise that God gives to us for those who choose to live their life and believe in the promise of life that comes in the Son, S-O-N. And that's what I shared at the end of the message as I quoted from Romans chapter 8 about how Paul expresses that even in our present life we experience frustration because we live in a fallen world, and only when we take our focus off of life in the Son, S-U-N, and focus it back on the promises of God, life in the Son, S-O-N, can we find hope for this life. Listen as I share this connection between what Solomon was saying and what Paul taught in Romans chapter 8.
It exists from the hand of God. At the end of the book, Solomon summarizes this, and actually it's really an editor who puts it all together. And this is the summary of the book, and it really helps us see that throughout the book, he keeps coming back to this conclusion. He says in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, now all that has been heard, here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. If we would just remember that life was never meant to be lived under the sun, S-U-N, we have to look above it. We have to find meaning above it in a transcendent reality, in a person and his promise to us. And as Christians, we know what that promise is. The promise is eternal life in Jesus Christ. The focus of the gospel is not our best life now in this earth, but to experience life with God today in a relationship and to prepare us for an eternity with him. And in one sense, Ecclesiastes prepares us to know our need of the gospel. In Romans,
that was my point that I wanted to make. Not that we can't live a pretty good life now, maybe even to use the term of a book, a pretty good life, almost your best life now. I mean, we want to be good fathers. We want to be good husbands. We want to be good neighbors. We want to be good Christians. No, I'm not saying we shouldn't be. But if we're putting all of our hope in this life, eventually this life will disappoint us, because life under the sun, S-U-N, in a fallen world, will just do that. Sooner or later, there'll be a frustration, a disappointment, a hurt that we can't control. And therefore, the reality of Ecclesiastes points us toward the need to live a life differently, not under the sun, S-U-N only, but life in the Son, S-O-N. And that's what Romans chapter 8 reminds us, that our focus needs to be beyond this life to the promise of eternal life in Jesus Christ.
Romans chapter 8, and I'm finishing up. In Romans chapter 8, Paul helps us understand the connection between Ecclesiastes and the gospel this way, because he says that our current experience in life is a lot like what Solomon says. Contrary to what you think, our best life is not now. Maybe some of you said, tell me something I don't know. I just lived through 2021. The reason why we don't have our best life now and can't have our best life now is because we live in a fallen world. Notice what Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verse 20. For the creation was subjected to frustration. The word could be translated vanity, vapor-like quality. It refers to this striving, and we can't receive it. We still live in that reality today. Why? Because we live in a fallen world. And it's God who subjected the world to this fallenness. Why? So that we would recognize that we can't put our hope in what we see under the sun, S-U-N. That we have to seek a promise of life in the Son, S-O-N. Without him, we have no hope. So if you don't believe the gospel, Ecclesiastes is your reality. You live, you attain a certain measure of wealth and pleasure, and then you die. Yes, you appear before the judgment of God, and you're given account for your life, and you're judged. But life under the sun ends. Life under the sun, S-U-N, ends if you don't have the gospel hope. It's only the gospel and the promise of life in the Son, S-O-N, that allows us to escape this world and its corruption. Notice what.
So I think that was one of the important points that I was emphasizing. If you think about it, therefore, Ecclesiastes is a very helpful book for us, because number one, it encourages us to ask good questions. You know, as Albert Einstein said, ask the right questions and you get the answer you're looking for. It also helps us put our life in focus, to think about, are we focusing on all the things under the sun, S-U-N, rather than orienting our lives toward life in the Son, S-O-N, and the promises that God has for us. It's also actually a good book to study, because it could be used really to evangelize and to share the gospel with others. Many people feel this hopelessness of life under the sun, S-U-N, just as Solomon did. And the questions that they're asking can only be answered by the gospel hope, life in the Son, S-O-N. So let us be people who ask good questions, who are willing to look at our lives in focus and offer the hope of the gospel, which is the only true hope. beyond this life of under the sun, S-U-N, living it for the glory of God and his Son, S-O-N. All right, I hope this little video was helpful for you. Use it for devotional materials, share it with others, and let's think about these important issues in our lives in the coming week. I want to encourage you to do two things. If you want to pray or talk with me further about this, just text me, email me, phone me. Let me know if you have any questions about the message from this past Sunday or what I've shared here, or comment in the Facebook or in the YouTube channel so that I can interact with you. I'd love to hear from you what your thoughts are about this message. It's a way for us to stimulate conversation throughout the week. God bless. Thanks for listening.